Namaste. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're in the third week of our Global Festival of Yoga, and our theme for this year is wisdom, healing, and well-being. So our session for this evening is going to be about how we align our spine when we sit for pranayama and meditation. So how we align the spine and pelvis can influence our ability to channel energy through our main energy pathways, the Sushumna, Ida, and Pingla Nadi. And conducting our session this evening is Dr. Rob Lamport, who's joining us all the way from Italy. Dr. Lamport has been a yoga practitioner for more than 25 years and a doctor of chiropractic. Namaste, Rob. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sophie.
It's so fantastic to have you. Thank you. So I was just telling our participants that you've been a yoga practitioner for over 25 years and a doctor of chiropractic. And you're also the founder of More Than Anatomy, which is an online resource for yoga teachers and students who want to learn more about the human body in relation to yoga. So we're very excited about our session this evening, and I'm going to hand the session over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophie. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be joining us from today. I've got a small presentation for you. I'm just going to share my screen. One second. Okay. So today's presentation, as Sophie mentioned, is really about our spine in meditation. And we're going to look mostly at the physical understanding of how we should sit and how that may relate to our ability to practice deeply in meditation and pranayama. This image here is of my lovely wife, Tara, and you may just see one of our little dogs, Chintu, sneaking in. Now, Chintu is a very sneaky little dog. He loves yoga. And one of his favorite things to do, I should add, is to get on the yoga mat whenever possible. Particularly, I've noticed when after I finish my practices, after the pranayama and meditation, when I'm doing shavasana, he'll often sneak in and he will lie between my legs. And my feeling, the reason that he does that is because he loves that energy that's created from yoga practice, the stillness that it generates, and he feeds off that positive energy. But he's always getting his little nose into our yoga practice. As Sophie mentioned, I am a doctor of chiropractic. Some of you may be or may not be aware of what a chiropractor does, but essentially we are technicians of the nervous system originally. Many of us now think of us as a back specialist or a joint specialist, but really we set out as being specialists in the nervous system and ensuring that the nervous system could work as it's designed to without impediment. So our main job really is to check the spine and the rest of the body for nerve pressure, nerve irritation, which may be causing dysfunction in the body. So our main focus is the spine, but really it's the spinal cord and the nerve roots, the nerves which exit from the spine, which then feed into our muscles, our organs, all our other tissues, which is our main concern. Now, in relation to yoga, when we consider the spine, it houses the main nadi, Sushumna nadi, which we may consider to be in the physical equivalent, the spinal cord itself. Therefore, yoga and pranayama have, yoga and chiropractic have these similarities in terms of we want the spine to function correctly, because then we have the best chance to ultimately live, have a healthy life, but also perhaps channel this energy, this Kundalini energy, this higher energy through our spines and achieve higher spiritual gains and benefits. So There's this energetic side. Mostly we're going to focus on the physical characteristics of seated practices today, troubleshoot some reasons why sometimes we have discomfort, and also consider why we want to align the spine in a particular way. So essentially there's a point in the body where it's balanced, where we are aligned, and Tara's sitting quite nicely for us here. I've actually asked her to exaggerate this curve just a little bit so we could see it a little bit better, because there are natural curves in our spine. So when we look at someone from the side and we consider the spine as being straight, there are natural curves. It's impossible for the spine to be completely straight in this particular angle. There is a lumbar curve through here in the low back, then a thoracic curve through here, and then a cervical curve. But essentially, we want to stack all those different vertebrae up on top of each other to create a point of balance. Because when we have that point of balance, then stresses to the body are minimized, but most importantly, the energy consumption to maintain that position is minimal. Because obviously you can appreciate when we want to practice pranayama and meditation, we want all the other systems to completely slow down, switch off, the heart rate to come down, the hormone levels to balance, the mind to become very focused. If we're having to do a lot of the effort to maintain this seated posture, then it's very challenging, and it makes our seated practice much harder to do. So for example, in this position now, we've got the pelvis tilted back. This straight away becomes harder on the lumbar spine. We now have a rounding of the thoracic spine and an increase in the neck curvature as well. Also, the head starts to protrude forward. So in this situation, not only will there be greater strain on the muscles which have to support the neck, because now the head has gone forward, more muscle activity has to maintain that position. So a lot of tension develops, but also the stresses into the neck increase. So the tissues such as the intervertebral disc, the disc between each bone, that's under more pressure, as well as the vertebrae themselves. If we have this opposite situation where the pelvis is now tilted forward, the lumbar curve increases, again, that puts a lot of pressure in the low back. The muscles, the back here will be working very hard to maintain that position. It's harder for us to relax. So it's a useful thing to look at either your students, or even sometimes I suggest that you take a couple of images of yourself and see your alignment and how well it stacks up. I'll show you a few things that you can do around that as well to test yourself, because if you follow me at all on Instagram, I made a post about this just yesterday to promote this talk, but also to describe the particular issue that I had about 11 years ago. So I'm a Vipassana meditator. And after my third Vipassana sit back in 2010, right after I finished, I developed a terrible case of sciatica because I'd been leaning in an incorrect way. So I'd been seated and I felt fairly comfortable, but I was leaning to one side. As I did that, I put more pressure into the sciatic nerve, and the injury was so severe that any particular movement, it would just shoot down my leg and be extremely painful. It was such a severe injury that it's never been the same since, and this is why I'm particularly excited about this particular topic. And when I was asked to speak about this, I felt I had a lot to share. So getting the posture right is really important. It takes pressure off the tissues. It makes our meditative practices a little bit easier. So one really simple thing that you can do, okay, is to understand your alignment using the occiput to wall distance. And I call it the wall guru. It gives us the understanding of how our head is positioned and how we are aligned in our spine. It also tells you whether you are actually having a kyphosis. A kyphosis is a rounding of the upper back beyond the normal. So what you simply do is you stand in a straight position as you would normally, just in a relaxed position, and then edge back to a wall and see what touches first. So with Tara, as I got her to do that, her shoulders and the back of the head came into contact straight away because she has the right alignment and her thoracic curve is correct. However, in someone with a thoracic curve, if you ask them to do that, when they come back, their head will be further forward. The occiput is the skull bone at the base of your head. That will be further forward, okay? And this indicates a thoracic kyphosis. It's a really, really simple thing that you can do on yourself or anyone to see how well aligned you are, because this is associated with lots of different issues. When the head gets forward, as I mentioned earlier, it puts more stresses on the tissues. The relative weight of the head increases and upsets these tissues greatly. But it's also associated with other things, such as poor physical function. Just give me 1 second, because I believe, can you, Sophie, can you hear me still okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So it's associated with poor physical function in women. It's associated with severity of pain in the spine, so vertebral pain, so pain in the bones of the spine. It's associated with decreased emotional status, such as depression, muscular impairments, and motor function. It's also particularly associated with difficulties in breathing or irregularities in breathing and overall ventilatory dysfunction, so your ability to breathe. So obviously, if we want to practice pranayama, then this head position is not going to give us the best opportunity. So a really, really useful little test that you can do on yourself. Now, I am certainly not the most knowledgeable person when it comes to yogic texts and philosophy. There are far more knowledgeable people, and many of those I've seen have already spoken through the festival, which is great to see. So I will give you my basic understanding of working with energy through the spine. Many years ago, one individual, quite a learned individual, described that the spinal cord, so we've got the brain stem, and then the spinal cord running through the spine to around about here, L1 and L2, and then we've got this tissue called the cauda equina, which is essentially these nerve tracts which run down to the spine. At the base of the spine, we've got the root chakra, and then through at various levels, where there are often collections of nerves or plexuses, we have these other chakra as well. So we're trying to channel this energy, this lower energy, through the root chakra, all the way up through the head, and then to connect for higher spiritual purposes. So if we align the spine straight in this position, and now we can have a straight spine. Otherwise, apart from obviously when I talked about the looking from the side, we've got our natural curves. In this position, we can have a straight spine. It gives our spinal cord and the main energy pathway, the Sushumna Nadi, the best chance to connect up above. If we lean to one side, as I will show you shortly, then pressure within the spinal cord and therefore the Sushumna Nadi and potentially Ida and Pingala as well, the subsidiary nadis on the left and right hand side of Sushumna are also impeded and becomes very difficult. But also consider that when you sit down, the pressure which you exert on your pelvis, including your sit bones and your coccyx, creates a certain pressure, which is therefore important to perhaps stimulate this energy up through the body. If you are leaning to one side, the pressure now is uneven. So I've had Tara lean to the left and then lean to the right on this side. The pressure will increase on this side into her buttocks compared to this side, and therefore may be detrimental. My teacher, the wonderful Sri O.P. Tiwari ji, who some of you may be aware of, he's the honorary secretary of Kalayava Dhamma in Lonavala, India. He was a direct student of Swami Guvalayananda. He often talks about pranayama and it being really a control of pressures. We are controlling pressures, for example, in oxygen and CO2 levels, but also controlling pressures in different cavities in the body. So, for example, we might use Mula Bandha, the root lock, to control pressure in the pelvic cavity. We may use Uddiyana Bandha, the abdominal lock, to control pressure in the abdominal cavity. And then as we breathe and we take breath in, and as we hold breath, and then as we exhale, we're changing, again, pressure within the thoracic cavity. So we're using these different pressures to potentially stimulate energy up from these lower points and draw it up through the spine. If we are putting different pressure into one side of the buttocks, which will also change the pressure in the spinal cord and the spine, again, that alters our ability to draw this energy up and through. Now, this is stating the obvious to some extent. You know, we know we shouldn't align like this, but I'm always amazed to this day that I spent at least 10 to 12 years leaning like this, and no one ever pointed that out to me. So not only did it create that particular issue with my sciatic nerve, and also issues actually with my lower back, but it also, I'm sure, hampered my ability to move that energy through my body. So I've got a couple of little videos for you to show some different things in terms of what's happening with the disc when we are in these different seated positions. So this is the vertebrae here. So this is a model. We've got the vertebrae at the top and the vertebrae below. And this red structure through here is called the intervertebral disc, or the IVD for short. At the back, this orange tissue, or really plastic, really in the model, is representing the spinal cord running down through the back of the spine. And then these structures here are the nerve roots. Okay. Now, when we sit, the pressure increases. So you can see now the pressure has increased and it's changed the shape of my disc. There's no pressure and there's pressure. So as we sit down, that pressure in the spine increases. Okay. If, for example, I lay on my back, I've now taken gravity out of the situation and pressure decreases. Okay, I sit back up, pressure increases. So as we sit, a certain pressure is exerted within the spine. And if we are aligned optimally correctly, that pressure, that load is distributed evenly without any undue stress or irritation to the body. If, for example, I start flexing my head or rounding my spine, that pressure will actually increase further and not only potentially damage this tissue, but also, as we see in a moment, affect these tissues as well. Now, this image is, or this video is showing the changes not only to the spine, but how potentially it can affect the nerves and the spinal cord when I'm going into lateral flexion. So if I'm leaning to one side, can you see, for example, this nerve root here and this nerve root here, how they're either being compressed potentially through here, or stretched and a different tension being placed in the one above. So this space that we have through here, called the IVF, or intervertebral foramen, is a very small space between each vertebrae where the nerve root exits. And this nerve root, as I'll show you later, will then join with another nerve root to form nerves such as the sciatic nerve, which then will supply the lower limb, the leg. But this, for example, this nerve root could go to an organ. It might go to the liver, the digestive organs, go to the lungs, the heart, so on and so forth. These nerve roots are very, very important. The space for this nerve root is quite small. In fact, the nerve root takes up about 70% of the available space in the neck, for example. So there's not a lot that you need to do to move to put pressure on this nerve. Now, when we think about our yoga asana practice, we move in these different directions and try and mobilize the spine to maintain the health of the joints, to keep the joints lubricated and healthy, to maintain muscular strength and control of the joints, but are also influencing the nervous system. So as I move into one direction, I might put pressure on a nerve, and then I decrease pressure on a nerve. And I do that a number of times. And that, again, comes back to the example I made of earlier, is that our yoga practice is very much around alternating pressures, controlling pressures. So if I put pressure on the nervous system, temporarily, I may impede the flow through that nerve, but then when I decrease it, I suddenly open it out, and that might then therefore send more signal down through it. Perhaps a better example is with a blood vessel. So for example, in certain positions, for example, if I bring my leg into a half lotus position and I position the heel appropriately, I can put pressure onto the femoral artery, which is really the main blood vessel which supplies your leg. I temporarily block that or impede the flow of the blood, and then I remove it, and then all of a sudden the rush of blood down into the limb. In the yoga text, they sometimes describe that as being one of the benefits. You are essentially blocking and then unblocking the blood supply, which rejuvenates and changes this pressure once more. We can do that with the nervous system as well. So we can do that as we're moving along through our different positions as we practice asana, but it comes back to that example again. If I'm leaning to one side or bent in the wrong position, I'm potentially impeding nerve flow. And really the nervous system is one part of the nadi system as well, okay? And particularly, as I said, this Sushumna nadi. And then lastly, let's just look at flexion and extension. So again, you can see the changing relationship between the vertebrae and the nerve root through there, and the differences that might have on the spinal cord. So that's my other dog there, Mia, getting into the background. So that gives you a little bit of understanding. When it comes to sitting for a long period of time, one of the issues that we sometimes have is we start to get a little bit uncomfortable. Now, it's just worth mentioning that the disc here has a very poor blood supply. Its blood supply is really reliant on movement. So as we move, essentially load through the spine either increases or decreases, increases or decreases, and that acts like a pumping effect. And that pumping effect actually helps to draw new fluids into the tissues, nutrients to help maintain the tissues, but also to supply energy to cells, but also the pressure which increases forces the waste products out. Now, when you sit for a long period of time, that pumping is lost to a great extent, okay? Breathing to some extent will maintain some pumping, but not a great deal. Now, the issue that you've got in this situation is that compression or that constant steady pressure within that tissue means that this disc starts to starve. Essentially gets, there's a lack of nutrients going in, lack of energy going in, and the disc can start to get a little bit unhappy. and it can actually sometimes cause it to degenerate and create an issue. If you do have a disc issue, sitting for long periods of times is problematic. However, there seems to be a certain difference between sitting in meditation and pranayama, particularly when that posture is balanced, versus sitting for a long period of time, for example, in a car or working at the desk at the office. My feeling is that when you are practicing pranayama, that steady, and meditation as well, I should add, that constant pressure that we have in the disc is slightly different because we are working with the energy more. And it seems to me, in my feeling in particular, that the starvation or this disc running out of nutrients is less of a problem. But as I said, if you do have a disc issue, sitting for a long period of time sometimes is problematic, and therefore either practicing and then lying down in shavasana, because we said once you lie down in shavasana, we've taken the compression out, fluid can run back in, the fluids in here can normalize, and then you come back into a vertical position once more. My teacher, Sri O.P. Tawariji, he'll often have individuals practice shavasana between, for example, each pranayama practice. So for example, maybe an individual is practicing 10 rounds of anulom vilom. You will have them practice, then lie down on their back for 1 or 2 minutes just to regulate things, and then come back and continue their practice. If you have a disc issue, that might be something to consider doing yourself. We'll just think a little bit more about the spinal cord. So when we're in spinal flexion, and again, Tara's performing a posture here for us, this is quite an extreme example of spinal flexion, but when you are flexing the spine, the cord lengthens. When you are extending the spine, the cord shortens. So again, we're changing pressure within that. When we lengthen the spine, the cross-sectional area of the spine decreases. So another way to think about that, if that term is confusing for you, if you have an elastic band, it has a certain thickness. If you pull on that elastic band, you'll notice that it actually looks now thinner. But then when you relax it, that thickness comes back. So actually we can manipulate, we can change the size of the cord to some extent in the cross-sectional area, the tension within the cord by moving our spines in different ways. And again, this is one of the benefits of practicing these different asana, not necessarily to such a great extent for everyone. Not everyone is required or needs to do this type of large range of motion, but even some can still be very, very beneficial. It comes back to that particular point. If our spine is aligned, we've got the normal amount of pressure or tension within the spinal cord, within Sushumna Nadi, and therefore potentially the greater ease that we're going to have to draw that energy up. So the lengthening of the cord can be thought of as an unfolding and refolding. It's a little bit like a concertina, that musical instrument, or a fan or a pump that has, it closes up and then draws back out as you play that music. You know, I don't play it myself, as you can probably imagine, but as you play that music and you're you're squeezing in, it all closes in and then it draws back out again. It's an unfolding and refolding of it. So finding the spine's neutral point in a seated posture places no undue tension on the cord and is potentially the best place to position ourselves. Now, this is an image of, it's an X-ray of the pelvis. And this image here in yellow is of the, essentially of the sciatic nerve. So I mentioned earlier that I injured my sciatic nerve from a Vipassana sit, but Vipassana sits, or these meditations, these 10-day sits, if you're not familiar with them, are quite intense. Generally, you might sit for about 10 hours a day for 10 consecutive days. So a lot of seated practice, which most people, most of us are not necessarily often used to. This sciatic nerve runs down the leg. It's the largest or longest nerve in the body, but it's formed by different nerve roots. So different levels of the spine. We've got these nerve roots. We've got L5 nerve root here between the 5th lumbar vertebrae, and then, S1 nerve root between the 5th lumbar bone and the top of the sacrum. You can see they join in together to then form the sciatic nerve. You can see the close relationship between the nerve and your sit bone and the hip joint. This image is slightly deceptive. This nerve root is actually behind through here. Now, when we sit in a meditative posture, whether it be lotus, for example, or sukhasana, whatever it might be, the relationship of the position of the hip changes quite significantly. And you will find that the pressure on this nerve can sometimes increase, particularly if you don't have a lot of flesh on your buttocks. If you're quite lean, you don't have much cushioning and tissue support around there, that can put sometimes more pressure through onto the nerve. And if you, in my case, and in other people's case, you lean to one side, it can put pressure into the nerve as well. And this can be one of the reasons why your leg goes to sleep, well, falls asleep whilst you're in meditation or practicing pranayama. So the thing to consider in this particular situation is what part of the leg, or is the whole leg, going to sleep? Because if you compress the nerve here, literally your whole leg, particularly from below your knee, will go to sleep completely. And you may have had that experience before, that you come out of your practice and you can't move your foot for a while. You may have experienced that also perhaps in your sleep. Maybe you slept awkwardly and you wake up and you can't move your arm. It's completely dead because you've trapped your nerve in a particular way. It's compressed it and it's blocked the supply to the muscles, and you've lost control temporarily. If you ever had that, you're quite shocked to begin with. You think, oh, I'm never going to be able to move again. I'm paralyzed. I can't move. And then over a period of time, you can feel it start to wake back up and you can move again. And it's a big relief when that does take place. If you block the nerve here, literally your whole leg will go to sleep. If, however, you are having a block around here, perhaps you have a disc issue, 1 or 2 levels around here perhaps, then only the block takes place there, and then you get a specific change in the leg. So for example, when you get a compression around L5, just the outside of the leg will become numb. Sometimes it might feel like it's fall asleep. It might feel that there's a burning sensation, that there's ants crawling along it. There can be different things, but sometimes seated in that position can compress through here as well. If you are having that, if your leg goes to sleep, a particular area of your leg rather than the whole leg, that points towards a disc issue and something you really want to get checked out to make sure that there's nothing untoward, and to see if you can get that a little bit better. But this is really compression around here in this kind of vicinity is the main reason that your legs will go to sleep. If you do that for a short period of time and then don't repeat that particular pressure, it will recover. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, compressing and then releasing, you could argue, is beneficial. But repeated irritation, so for example, in my particular instance, where you just keep adding irritation, insult, it can permanently change it. There is one other known case that this occurred in. Someone was practicing meditation in Vajrasana or hero posture, and they actually compressed the nerve at the back of the knee. And they just kept doing it and doing it again and again and again, to a point where they injured the nerve so much
that they had what's called foot drop. So their foot, rather than being able to pick up, it just drops down. It became completely limp. And that never actually recovered. So listen to your body a little bit in terms of doing it. Sometimes, as I said, a little bit of pressure is fine, but too much can be causing an issue. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was our seated postures and right or left leg first. Now, particularly in some traditions, they will suggest that, as we see Tara doing in this upper image, that we bring in the right leg first and then the leg over on top of that. There are different reasons which are described for doing that. And again, I must point out that I'm not the most learned fellow out there in terms of philosophy and text, so I can only really relate to what I've been told from people who know more than me, is that there are different reasons why we might do this. One of my teachers said, okay, the example is that when we step through a new house, we should lead with our right leg. The right side, for example, is considered more auspicious, having more positive energy. Therefore, when we want to practice pranayama and meditation, we want to have a positive energy. We want to remove that negative energy. So we bring the right side in first and then the left. There is another argument that, as you can see, the heel is a little bit higher when we bring the left leg in second. You can see now that relationship changes in this lower image. This, some people have argued that places more pressure on the abdomen, particularly around the location or region or vicinity, really, of the appendix, this little part of your digestive tract, and is therefore the reason that we do that. My teacher, when I asked him about this recently, I said, is there a big difference between doing right and left sides? Does it affect things? And he pointed out the fact that if you haven't taught an individual how to do lotus, if you haven't cultured their mind what they should be doing, then a right-hander will bring the right leg in first, whereas a left-hander will bring the left side in first of all. He believes, and he knows far more than I do, that there's no difference in the two. So there's different arguments in it. Now, many, many years ago, a very well-known yoga teacher, I won't mention their name, and I had a conversation about this, and they asked me my opinion, and we discussed things. And basically their feeling was that if you constantly bring in just the right side first and then the left, and I'm not necessarily just talking about lotus posture, I'm also talking about any cross-legged position, because there are different variations of a seated posture that we could utilize for our seated practices. If you're doing the same side or the same manner each particular time, it creates an issue. And it often can create an issue around the hip, but also around the sacroiliac joint, this interesting joint at the back of our body, and also the lower back. And I would urge you to experiment with this in terms of, if you normally practice just in one specific way, if you always bring the right leg in first, tomorrow or this evening or whenever you're practicing next, try it the opposite way. And you'll realize that there is a greater difficulty in doing it and imbalance. And you can see that a little bit for Tara. She's done that because she's not so used to doing that position, as it would be the case for pretty much anyone. This knee pops off the ground. That creates a certain imbalance in the hip, in the sacroiliac joint, around the pelvis and the lower back. And because we need that balance, because we need everything aligned, we need Ida and Pingala nadis to be balanced for them to potentially then feed into Sushumna nadi and open the dormant Sushumna nadi, and then to bring up Kundalini. If we don't have balance, that is potentially much harder for us to do. So my feeling is it should be alternated. Many people may argue with that, but that's just my feeling. And then the last point I just wanted to make was around sitting on a chair versus sitting on the floor. And there's a few observations that I have around this that I wanted to share with you. The first observation is this: if you monitor your heart rate when you're sitting on a chair doing your meditation practice or pranayama, and then after some time, come down and sit on the floor, and then recheck your heart rate. And many people nowadays have these heart rate monitors and they can easily check it. You'll often find that it's between 3 and 5 beats slower seated on the floor than seated on a chair. My feeling is that's partly because of the cross-legged position. There's also potentially less effort in maintaining that position on the floor as a more stable base. Therefore, it changes blood flow, it changes our requirement for oxygen and nutrients to be pumped through the body, and therefore the heart has to work less hard. So being sat on the floor is less taxing, less energy requiring. So therefore potentially allows us to go deeper into our practices, because everything slows down. Particularly if our sympathetic nervous system slows down, we start to relax more. That allows us to become more centered, more focused, and achieve the things that we want to. I'm not saying that sitting on a chair is bad. I'm just pointing out the differences between the two, because certainly sitting on a chair can have its benefits, particularly if an individual is very tight in the hips and not used to that position. If they're tight in the hips, often then they go into this slouch position, and now we've lost that good spine alignment. So sitting on a chair can often allow the individual to maintain a much better position and allow them to go deeper in their practices, because as many of you can appreciate, I'm sure, if you're uncomfortable practicing, it's very difficult, very, very difficult. And often you can argue that's coming from the mind. If the mind relaxes and becomes more balanced, then the physical pain disappears. I completely agree, completely agree. But if in the early stages we can ensure that comfort, it makes our journey that little bit easier. Okay. So sitting on a chair can sometimes be a good place to start to find better understanding of spine alignment. But also when we think about the benefits on the heart rate, it might be one other reason. My other feeling around this is that being sat on the floor allows the pelvis to come into contact with the ground, and therefore our root chakra, and that creates a greater kind of energy connection with the floor. Whereas when we're sat on a chair, we've got all this space and air underneath us, and therefore our rooting is not perhaps as good. Therefore, it might be more ground seated on the floor position, whether it be Padmasana or any other posture. So they're the points that I wanted to cover. I hope you found that interesting. I will open this up now to any questions that you might have, and I'll do my very best to answer them for you.
Namaste. Thank you so much, Ravji. That was amazing. There was so much detail, and I think it was such a relevant session, because almost everyone who practices yoga at some point, we all sit to breathe, whether you're practicing pranayama, whether you're practicing vipassana, silent meditation. So I think our session this evening is going to help a lot of our participants. Thank you for that detailed, amazing presentation. And also thank you to Tara for modeling for all the photos. That was wonderful. So far we've got 2 questions. Our first question is from Subramanyam Ji. He's asking if doing meditation for some time, can it cause breathing issues and gas?
No, not in my feeling. No, if when you're breathing correctly, if you're allowing the breath to take place correctly, the great thing that's happening is that the diaphragm, this main muscle of respiration, just around here, is going to be moving. So as you inhale, you're going to be seeing that diaphragm move nicely, okay? And every time you take a breath in, that essentially increases the pressure within the abdominal cavity, and that pressure exerts into the abdominal organs, and therefore breathing correctly is beneficial for digestion. Certainly, it may be the case for some people if they're in that slouched position, which I've covered a couple of times through today's talk. If they're rounded in their spine, that's going to restrict their chest and change the way that they breathe, and therefore affect the way that they can get air into the body, and therefore potentially change the gases within our body. So if you're breathing correctly, if you're aligned correctly, I don't think it causes the issue. So I recommend that you perhaps consider some of the things that we talked about spine alignment today, and addressing that and seeing if that has a particular benefit. The other thing I would say around that as well, though, if I can add to it, is that depending on your particular situation and what you're experiencing, what you'll find sometimes with pranayama meditation is you go into a more parasympathetic. So normally there's two aspects of the nervous system we can think about in a very simplistic manner. The sympathetic nervous system, which is all the activity, the fight or flight. I might describe it as the accelerator on the car. It makes you go faster, work harder, supplies the muscles, get hormones pumping. Whereas the parasympathetic, or rest or digest, or the brake of the car, slows everything down. So sometimes what you find is, as you start to go into your practices, you go deep into them, the sympathetic goes down, the parasympathetic comes up, and your digestive organs start to get the nerve supply that they need. Okay. And now your digestive system is dealing with all the things that you've eaten that day, the day before, particularly if the diet is a little bit off and it's sluggish bowels. And now you start to feel things. Now you start to feel that gas is forming because your body is starting to cleanse. So that, in some instances, might be that situation.
Thank you so much. So Subramanian ji, I hope that answers your question. Our next question is, someone's asking how to sit in Padmasana if they have scoliosis on the right side. Would you then, and then that's causing a tilt, would you then advise them to do the right or the left leg first?
I would, when it comes to scoliosis, there's so many different types. There's lots of different causes. It can affect different regions of the spine. It can, lots of different factors involved. Generally, if I, when you look at, you won't be able to see it now, but in terms of, generally you'll find that when you go into lotus, if you bring in the right side first and the left, the side you bring in second will be a little bit higher off the ground. Okay. The tendency generally is if you bring in the right side first, you will lean potentially a little bit more to the right, but not necessarily. Okay. Not necessarily. If the lotus is very balanced and you're deep in that, even if the knee is off a little bit, you should have a very firm foundation, which shouldn't affect anything else. It shouldn't kick you off to one side. If your lotus isn't balanced, it certainly could be off into one direction. You might need to consider it. But even if, for example, your pelvis is perfectly aligned, you've got a good foundation, even switching sides might not necessarily affect the balance that's taking place in the spine. It depends on your particular situation. So I would play around with both sides, even take a few photos of yourself and see what looks better to you. But you need a bit of an understanding of your spine and what's actually taking place. Very, very difficult question to answer that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. Then we have two people asking about sciatica. So I'm going to combine those questions. The first question, well, it's a question in three parts. The first question is, are there any postures that one can sit in to relieve this? And the next question is, a lady, Shefali ji, has had an operation 6 months ago. So even she's suffering from some kind of sciatic pain. So she was asking if you recommend homeopathy and maybe suggest some postures to relieve this.
There's there's always variation because it's case by case basis that we need to consider these things, and obviously we don't understand the operation that one of the ladies that has asked this question. When it comes to sciatica, one of the simplest things you do and safest things that I can relay now that we can apply pretty much to most people is a posture called flapping fish, where you would lie on your front. If you lie on your front, and the side where you're having the sciatica, you draw, you're not going to see me very well, but you're going to draw that leg up in towards your body. Perhaps the easiest thing to do is I send an image to you, Sophie, to help describe that. But essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the knee up towards the shoulder through here, and then we rest on that side. Okay, what that does is it takes all the tension out of the sciatic nerve. Okay, and therefore can sometimes help relax it. It can also change the position of the spine slightly and sometimes decrease pressure. True sciatica comes from the spine. Okay, so true sciatica is either a disc issue pressing into the nerve root or some other pathology or issue around there. Certainly the sciatic nerve can be compressed around the hip, particularly around the piriformis, and as I showed you earlier. And sometimes there can be a lot of tight tissues around the hip, and stretching the hip can be very beneficial. But again, we don't really know which is the case. You can find in certain situations that, for example, in a case where the nerve is caught in the spine, trying to stretch the hip out aggravates the spine and causes a problem. So generally, I would go, the safest thing to do is to take the tension out of the nerve. I'll share an image with Sophie, who perhaps can then share it with you to help explain that a little bit better. Homeopathy, I don't have a lot of background in. Certainly it's worth exploring and understanding, finding a good yoga therapist to understand and look at your body. All our practices are so different. We use these different practices. We use, for example, the same pranayama techniques, but actually the types of pranayama used, or the ratio, the quantity, or the order of them changes based on our particular needs. And it's the same with a sciatic case. What is the cause? How do we need to fix that for that individual? So find a good yoga therapist and help them or get them to understand your body better.
Thank you so much. We seem to be having a lot of questions about sciatic pain. I think it's a common issue, but we're going to be asking Dr. Lamport for his details after this session. So I'm sure you guys can write into him and, probably visit his website. He also has a lot of courses. So I think we have time for a few more questions. One question is, what posture would you suggest, or what adjustment would you suggest for someone who's trying to sit but has uneven hips?
Uneven hip. Again, uneven hips can mean a lot of things. Is that because the tightness? Can we clarify? Is that tightness in the hips or some other particular issue?
No, it just says uneven hips and it's tilting to one side.
I would, to begin with, what I personally, I suggest going onto the chair. Going onto the chair to begin with, making sure that when you sit, so this is my back, and this is make sure the knees, these are the knees here, the knees are beneath the hips, okay? Because that'd be much easier. The lower chair, obviously the knees come up, and then you start to round very often. Keep that, the knees below the hips, and feel the sit bones on the chair. Really feel the amount of pressure on the left, so the left and right side. Make sure that's very even, and start to feel your spine and make sure that alignment is good. Sitting on a firm but not rock hard surface is good to begin with. Really connect with your sit bones and understand them. If you still feel uneven, you might need someone to look at your body and understand that a little bit better. But understand if you can sit even in that particular arrangement, and then try and see if you can repeat that on the floor with, it be lotus or any seated posture. Perhaps a starting point might be Vajrasana or hero pose. To sit in that might be more accessible for some people. It's not the best meditative posture, but it's certainly pretty good for many people. But then really you need to try and understand the issues around the hips. Is there weakness? Is there tightness? And try and work through that. And there's so many different things that we could discuss in that particular topic. Most of us, our hips have become very tight because we sit in chairs all the time and cars, and we don't move it through its full range of motion. Trying to restore that is really important. So really our asana practice is preparing us for the seated practice. So again, a good yoga therapist who understands your body, can understand what you need to do to open up specifically, is really important.
Thank you so much. So we have the questions really piling up, but as I said, we don't have time for all the questions, but also a lot of the questions that are being asked, this session has been recorded, and I think you've answered a lot of those questions through the session. So maybe everyone who's watching can go back, revisit this. It's going to be on our YouTube channel. We'll just take one last question. Vijay Lakshmi ji, because she's asked twice, would like you to just go over the lateral spine bend that you showed in the beginning, that one slide. She would just like you to reference that slide again, if possible, please, and talk about the lateral bend.
Sure. I'll just share my screen again. So this was the slide I'm pretty sure we were referring to. So we're talking about different tension on the spinal cord. And again, this is really important to understand that when we're using our asana to open up our body, move our body in different directions, it's not just muscles. All we hear about nowadays is good for this muscle, that muscle is good for core strength and gluteus medius and biceps and all this. You're changing every single tissue in the body, including blood vessels, including nerves. So when, for example, you go into Trikonasana, then you are going to lateral flexion. Okay, as you go into lateral flexion, this left-hand side of the spinal cord will be stretched, whereas the other side will be compressed, okay, or shortened. In the spinal cord, there is a certain amount of elasticity, so it can be stretched and then it will come back to its original position. Okay, but over a period of time, we can actually make that longer and change its nature, particularly through these different or large ranges of motion. So stretching this side, and again, you might argue now we're stretching or working more with Ida Nadi, so on the left-hand side, and when we reverse that, Pingala Nadi. And as I mentioned earlier, many of you may be aware of this, that to draw our energy up through Sushumna Nadi, we need a perfect balance between Ida and Pingala. Those nadis need to be in perfect balance, and then, only then, there's a chance, and I say only a chance, that the energy is diverted into Sushumna Nadi and that energy comes up. The best way to understand the balance between Ida and Pingala is through the nostrils. So you just see which nostril is more dominant. Okay, if the right is more dominant, it's easier to breathe through that, then Pingala is more active. And if vice versa, if the left side is more active, then Ida is more dominant. You need those in perfect equilibrium. The old trick, if you're not aware of this, is once you've tested, so I've done my test, I've worked out which is balanced. In the moment I'm balanced for some reason, but I'm balanced at the moment. But if you're unbalanced, if you find you're blocked in your right, you get a pillow or a rolled up towel or the danda, the yogic stick, and you stick it under that armpit and you keep it there. And then you do your meditation or your pranayama. And after some time, recheck. And often you'll find that balance is restored. Okay. So I highly recommend every single time you practice, you always check your nostrils first. And at the end of the practice, ideally they are, or very quickly within your practice, they start to balance out. As you deepen your practices, as you become more solid in your practices, as your diet gets better, as your sleep patterns get better, as your thought processes get better, my experience is this, that those two nadis become more and more balanced. The fluctuation between the two is less, and it's easier for you to potentially draw that energy up through Sushumna.
Thank you so much. And I think this also answers a lot of questions that we don't have time to address, but a lot of people were asking about the nadis and breathing. So I think that has in a way given them answers too. And I'd just like to say, if everyone, Dr. Lamport has been asking you to see a good yoga therapist. So his wife, Tara Mitra, is a yoga teacher. You could contact both of them because Tara also does retreats. She's an authorized Ashtanga teacher. And for all our participants who'd like to get in touch with you and attend your courses, could you give us your contact details, please?
Sure. Shall I put those in the chat box?
That would be best, I guess, so everyone can have access.
1 second. So that's my website, and I'll pop my email as well.
So that's morethananatomy.com.
Yeah.
For anyone who hasn't read, morethananatomy.com. And the email is mtanatomy@gmail.com. I will also put up these details on our Instagram and our website, so you guys have access to Dr. Lamport's work. Thank you so much for everything and for this session. Before we leave, can we have a poster of tomorrow's session so we know what we're doing for our festival tomorrow, Koti ji? Okay, so tomorrow in the morning, we're going to be having a session on neuroscience and yoga for pain by Dr. Mayur Kaku. And in the evening, we're going to have a session about how you can use loss to enrich your life. This is going to be conducted by Sujata Ameya, who's a relationship therapist and a self-actualization coach. So please join us for our sessions tomorrow. They're going to be very interesting. Thank you, Koti ji. Would you have any last words, a parting message for our participants?
Practice is my, as my teacher says, it doesn't matter how much you practice, just make that intent that if you're going to practice for 10 minutes once a week, that you do it. You set a time, you set it on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock, whenever it is, and you keep to it. And from that very positive seed, things start to grow, your consistency starts to grow, and then you're practicing twice a week, and then you're practicing for 20 minutes, and you just build upon that. So set that intention. It is really, really important in terms of not only your physical and mental, but also your spiritual health.
That's a beautiful message, and participants, I hope you all heed his good advice. And like I said, for everything, we've recorded this session. It's going to be available on YouTube. If you want to reach Dr. Lamport, it's morethananatomy.com. So please do. I hope this session has helped a lot of people. I'm sure it has, because I mean, we don't just, especially in India, we're not just sitting for meditation. It's part of our culture. You know, we sit a lot on the floor, whether it's in a cross-legged, simple Sukhasana position or Padmasana. It's how we eat food often. So really great session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you everyone for joining us. I really enjoyed speaking to you. I'm upset that I can't see you all and interact with you more, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Dhanyavad, everyone. Have a great evening.